Picture a young fighter standing in the center of Madison Square Garden, the most famous arena in American boxing. Across from him is a 20-year-old wrecking machine named Mike Tyson. Undefeated, terrifying, on the verge of becoming the youngest heavyweight champion the world had ever seen. For 10 full rounds, Tyson pounds away. He takes the man's mouthpiece. He knocks out a bridge holding a couple of teeth. And yet, when the final bell rings that night in 1986, one stubborn fact remains. The man across from Tyson never went down. Not once. Not to the canvas. Not to his knees. He simply would not fall. His name was Mitchell Green, but everyone knew him as Mitch Blood Green. And here is the strange, sad mystery at the heart of his story. A man who survived 10 rounds with prime Mike Tyson, a 4-time New York Golden Gloves champion, a fighter the sports insiders once whispered about as a future contender, is remembered today mostly for a wild street confrontation outside a Harlem clothing store at 4 o'clock in the morning. How does that happen? How does a fighter with that much promise, that much toughness, that much raw refusal to quit end up as a footnote in someone else's legend? That is the question that runs underneath everything you are about to hear. Because this is not simply a story about losing a boxing match. This is the story of a man who kept getting up, in the ring, in the courtroom, and on the street, while the machinery of professional boxing seemed determined to knock him back down. Born January 13th, 1957, in Augusta, Georgia, 6 feet 5 inches tall, with an 82-inch reach that could keep almost any man at the end of his fists. On paper, he had everything. So was Mitch Green destroyed by Mike Tyson? By the promoters who controlled his purse, or by his own fierce refusal to ever bend to anyone? Before he ever laced up a glove, Green survived 2 bullets on a Bronx street corner. And it was those gunshots, he later said, that pushed him toward boxing in the first place. To understand Mitch Green, you have to understand the streets that made him. He grew up in the Bronx on 175th Street, in the New York of the 1960s and 70s, a city of crumbling buildings, hard corners, and territory that had to be defended block by block. This was a world shaped by poverty and survival, where the difference between walking home safely and not walking home at all could come down to who you knew and how you carried yourself. This was a young man who understood danger, understood loyalty, and understood how to command respect in a place where respect was often the only currency that mattered. But the streets took their price. At the age of 17, Green was shot twice. The first bullet passed clean through his right wrist, and by what he considered nothing short of a miracle, it missed the arteries, missed the bones, missed the nerves. Within a few short weeks, he was back to fighting. The second time, a slug grazed the right side of his head, leaving a permanent scar he would carry for the rest of his life. 2 bullets, 1 young man, and somehow he was still standing. Green credited that survival to the will of God. He was not simply a street kid, either. Green attended DeWitt Clinton High School while working as a security guard, a fighter's job for a fighter's temperament. But those gunfights had shaken something loose in him. He came to believe that the streets, if he stayed in them, would eventually harm him. And so instead of walking deeper into danger, he walked into a boxing gym, trading the lethal violence of the corner for the controlled violence of the ring. Within just a few short years, he would be collecting Golden Gloves titles faster than almost anyone in the entire city of New York. When Mitch Green turned his fists toward boxing, The results came fast and they came hard. As an amateur, he became a phenomenon in New York City's fight scene, the crown jewel of the amateur world. He won the New York Golden Gloves, not once, not twice, but 4 times, in 1976, 1977, 1979, and 1980. 4 titles. That kind of dominance simply did not happen by accident. His amateur record tells the rest of the story. 64 wins against only 7 losses, with 51 of those victories coming by knockout. He wasn't just winning, he was ending fights. On top of the New York crowns, he became a 2-time Intercity Golden Gloves champion, taking one title by a first-round knockout and another by decision. And yet, even in dominance, there was a hint of the frustration that would shadow his whole career. There was one that got away. In the 1978 tournament, a cut, not a knockout, not a beating, just a cut stopped him and prevented him from claiming what would have been a 5th Golden Gloves title. That same year, he lost to the Russian boxing great Igor Vysotsky. It was early proof of a pattern. Mitch Green could be beaten only by elite opposition or by pure circumstance. Ordinary fighters simply could not put him away. The sports insiders noticed Green trained at a serious level and moved in serious company. He traveled to Tennessee, where he sparred with the WBA World Heavyweight Champion John Tate. He went to Washington, D.C., where he trained under Dave Jacobs, the very trainer who guided the great Sugar Ray Leonard. These were not the associations of a nobody. These were the connections of a genuine prospect, a young heavyweight the establishment believed in. By 1980, that belief had carried him to a shortlist for the Moscow Olympics, the platform that could have transformed him into a household name across America. Then, politics slammed the door shut before he ever threw a single punch on that stage. 1980 should have been the year Mitch Green stepped onto the world's biggest amateur stage. Instead, it became the year 2 doors slammed in his face, and neither one had anything to do with how hard he could hit. The first blow came from Washington, not from any opponent. In 1980, the United States announced it would boycott the Summer Olympic Games in Moscow. It was a geopolitical decision, made far above the heads of any athlete, and it erased the amateur dream of dozens of talented young Americans in a single stroke. Green, considered a serious prospect for those games, was among them. All that training, all that promise, and there would be no Moscow, no chance to compete, no medal to chase. The second door closed at the Olympic trials that same year. In the quarterfinals, Green lost to Marvis Frazier, the son of the legendary Joe Frazier. And so, in the space of a single year, both paths to Olympic glory were gone. The boycott had canceled the games, and the trials had ended without a breakthrough. Now, why does this matter so much? Because for most amateur fighters, the Olympics is the launch pad. It's the stage where a young man becomes a national name overnight, where an Olympic medal turns into bargaining power, into endorsements, into leverage at the negotiating table when the professional contracts come calling. It is the single greatest asset an amateur can carry into the paid ranks. Mitch Green never got that asset. No canceled games glory, no trials triumph, no medal to sell. He would enter the professional world with a spectacular amateur resume, but without the one credential that opened the biggest doors and gave a fighter real power over the men who would control his money. And so, carrying that quiet disadvantage, Green turned professional in 1980. He signed with a promoter who would very soon become the source of his very first money dispute, the opening chapter in a story of financial conflict that would follow him for decades. When Mitch Green stepped into the professional ranks in 1980, he did not step in quietly. He signed with promoter Shelley Finkel, a man he had first met back at the 1979 New York Golden Gloves. And under Finkel, Green became part of something with real national reach, a group of young, hungry professionals showcased on NBC under the banner Tomorrow's Champions. This was genuine exposure, the kind that put a fighter's name and face in front of millions of American households. Green rose as high as number 7 in the World Boxing Council standings and pushed his way into the top 10 of the World Boxing Association as well. Here was a 6'5" heavyweight with knockout power, national television behind him, and a spot among the most promising contenders in the division. The future looked wide open. But then came the first fracture, and it was not a fracture in his record. It was a fracture in trust. After roughly a year as a professional, Green left Shelley Finkel following a disagreement over payoffs. Money. The very thing that would haunt him again and again, from the amateur glory days to the final years of his career, first cracked the surface here. It is worth pausing on that, because it becomes the recurring theme of his entire story. Mitch Green would fight in the ring, yes, but he would fight just as hard, and sometimes harder, over what he believed he was owed. He was a man who felt, deep in his bones, that the sport was taking more from him than it was giving back. And once that feeling took hold, it never let go. To replace Finkel, Green made a fateful decision. He signed with a man whose last name carried enormous weight in the world of professional boxing, Carl King, the son of the most powerful and controversial promoter the sport had ever seen. It was a deal that would define his career, elevate him to his most famous night, and eventually leave him feeling more betrayed than ever. To be managed by Carl King in the 1980s was to stand very close to the center of power in professional boxing. Carl was the son of the sport's most famous and most controversial promoter, a man whose reach touched nearly every major heavyweight of the era. For a fighter like Mitch Green, that connection promised access, big nights, and the kind of leverage that most contenders could only dream about. But there was another side to that arrangement, a shadow side. Getting close to that kind of power meant surrendering control. It meant dependency. And for a man as fiercely proud and independent as Green, dependency was a slow poison. The cracks began to show quickly. On August 10th, 1985, Green stepped into the ring for a bid at the United States Boxing Association heavyweight title and suffered the first true loss of his professional career, a 12-round decision to Trevor Berbick, a man who would soon wear a world championship belt himself. It was not a knockout. It was not a beating. It was a decision, decided by the judges, and it ended Green's spotless record. But it did something else, too. It exposed just how thin the margin was between being a rising contender and being just another name on the undercard. And around this same stretch, the sport began to see the other side of Mitch Green. The volatility, the anger, the refusal to be ignored. In March of 1985, he stormed into a pre-fight press conference for the Larry Holmes and David Bay championship event, loudly declaring that he was a better contender than Bay and demanding his own shot at the top. It was raw, it was unfiltered, and it was aimed squarely at the king power structure that controlled who fought whom. That same year, a planned bout against James Broad for a regional title collapsed. And once again, the reason was money. Green dropped out over a purse dispute. The pattern was hardening now. A supremely gifted fighter who kept walking away from opportunities, because he believed again and again that he was being cheated. By 1986, Green was still ranked one spot ahead of an unbeaten 20-year-old phenomenon named Mike Tyson, and the two were about to be placed in the same ring, in a fight that would expose exactly how little Green was truly being paid. The bombshell dropped the night before the fight, at the weigh-in. The moment that should have been about weight and posturing and last-minute intimidation. Instead, it became about money and about a wound that would never fully close. Green learned that for stepping into the ring with Mike Tyson, he was being paid $30,000. Tyson, for the very same fight, was receiving $200,000, nearly 7 times as much. And on top of that, there was a separate deal reported to be worth a full $1 million, spread across a package of 3 broadcasts on cable television. Now stop and consider the humiliation of that. On paper, in the World Boxing Council rankings, Green was the more established man. His record stood at 16 wins, 1 loss, and 1 draw. Tyson's stood at 20 wins and no losses, but Green was ranked 1 spot ahead of him. The so-called opponent, the man being brought in to be beaten, was actually the higher-ranked fighter walking into that arena, and yet he was being paid a fraction of what the young challenger received. Green did what Green always did when he felt cheated. He threatened to walk away entirely. He would not fight, he said. And in that moment of leverage, a strange bargain took shape. Green finally agreed to go through with the bout, only after being offered his release from his managerial contract with Carl King, in exchange for accepting that short, insulting purse. Read that carefully, because it is one of the saddest arrangements in his entire story. Mitch Green was essentially being asked to fight his way out of his own contract. To take the punishment, to accept the humiliation of the pay gap, in order to buy back his own freedom. It was a deal born of frustration and pride and desperation all at once. And so, feeling cheated, feeling used, freed only on the condition that he step into the ring against the most feared young puncher on the planet, Mitch Green walked into Madison Square Garden. And there, under the lights of the world's most famous arena, he did something that almost no one else on earth would manage to do against that version of Mike Tyson. Understand what facing Mike Tyson meant in 1986. This was not the old, worn-down version the world would see decades later. This was a 20-year-old force of nature, a fighter who ended men in the opening minutes, who made grown professionals freeze the moment the bell rang. Just 6 months after this night, Tyson would demolish Trevor Berbick to become the youngest heavyweight champion in the history of the sport. That is the storm Mitch Green stepped into, and he stepped into it feeling cheated, feeling used, carrying every ounce of resentment from that weigh-in. For 10 full rounds on cable television, Tyson came forward, he landed, he hurt his man. Somewhere in the 3rd round, Green lost his mouthpiece, and along with it, as the ringside commentator Barry Tompkins memorably noted, a dental bridge holding a couple of teeth. Imagine that. A fighter losing pieces of his own mouth to the punches, and still coming forward, still standing, still refusing to give the crowd the ending everyone expected. Because here is the fact that would define the rest of his life. Mitch Green never went down. Not to the canvas, not to a knee. Across all 10 rounds against peak-era Mike Tyson, he stayed on his feet from the first bell to the last. On the scorecards, it was a lopsided decision loss. The judges were never in doubt about who won. But in the deeper accounting of a fighter's worth, it was something else entirely. It was a statement. Green became one of the very few human beings alive who could say he heard the final bell against that Tyson and never touched the floor. And there is the tragedy folded inside the triumph. That night was, in many ways, the peak of his career, and also the beginning of its unraveling. He had proven his toughness to the entire boxing world. He had earned genuine respect. But respect, as Green would learn in the bitterest way, does not deposit into a bank account. He had taken the beating. He had bought his freedom. And 1 week after the fight, that freedom he had fought so hard for would arrive in the ugliest possible form. The release came just a week after the Tyson fight. Carl King formally let Green out of his managerial contract, the very freedom Green had bargained for at that miserable weigh-in. On the surface, it was exactly what he had demanded. But freedom and abandonment can look remarkably alike, and it is worth asking which one Mitch Green actually received. Green had spent the previous week publicly accusing King of mishandling his career. Now, the ties were cut. But a fighter without a powerful manager in that era was a fighter without doors, without leverage, without a seat at the table where the real money was divided. The proof arrived that December. Green had been signed to appear on a major event promoted under the King banner, broadcast on cable from Madison Square Garden. He was scheduled to face James Bonecrusher Smith. It should have been a payday, a chance to build on the reputation he'd earned against Tyson. But then the machinery shifted above his head, the way it always seemed to. Tony Tubbs pulled out of the main event. Bonecrusher Smith was elevated into a title fight against Tim Witherspoon. And when the dust settled and no replacement opponent could be found, Mitch Green was simply left off the card entirely. No opponent, no fight, no payday. Erased from the show as if he had never mattered at all. You can feel the pattern tightening now, like a noose. Every time Green got close to the money and the momentum, the sport rearranged itself and pushed him outside the room. And Green, being Green, refused to suffer it quietly. He resurfaced at the negotiations surrounding the Witherspoon and Smith affair, once again publicly confronting the sport's most powerful promoter, once again demanding to be seen, to be paid, to be respected. This is the portrait that emerges as the 1980s wound down. A man increasingly at war with the entire power center of professional boxing, not with a single opponent, but with the whole structure that decided who fought, who got paid, and who got left behind. That war was eating him alive, and it set the stage for a confrontation that had nothing to do with a sanctioned ring, and everything to do with the rage that had been building inside him for years. The most infamous chapter of Mitch Green's life did not unfold under arena lights or before a paying crowd. It happened in the early morning darkness, around 4 o'clock, on the 23rd of August, 1988, on a street in Harlem. Mike Tyson, by then the reigning undisputed heavyweight champion of the world, was out with some friends, shopping at a well-known Harlem clothing establishment, famous for dressing the stars of that era. And Green, who had heard that Tyson was in the neighborhood, went looking for him. By the accounts that survive, Green arrived agitated, without a shirt, and immediately began hurling provocations at the champion, demanding the rematch he felt he had always deserved, pouring out years of grievance in the street. The resentment that had been building since that weigh-in 2 years earlier, the money, the release, the exclusions, all of it seemed to erupt at once, in the wrong place, at the worst possible hour. A scuffle broke out, and this is where the two accounts split, and where we must be careful. By one version of events, Green threw the first punch. Tyson responded, and when it was over, Green was left with a badly swollen, closed eye and a nose that required stitches. Tyson, for his part, broke his hand in the exchange, an injury serious enough that it forced the postponement of his upcoming first fight with the British contender Frank Bruno. That much about the physical damage is broadly agreed upon. A champion with a fractured hand, a former contender with a bloodied, stitched face. But the story of how it happened is fiercely disputed. Green would tell it very differently. In his telling, there was no fair fight at all. He maintained that Tyson had struck him without warning, a surprise blow he never saw coming, and then fled the scene before Green could even respond. Two men, two completely opposite versions of the same dark morning. And in the years that followed, one particular claim about Green's condition that night would grow into the single most sensational and most disputed detail of his entire life, a claim that came from only one source and one source alone. Here is where the street fight stopped being a street fight and started becoming something else entirely. A legend, a punchline, a story told for laughs and gasps in front of paying audiences. Because years after that pre-dawn scuffle in Harlem, Mike Tyson began telling his own version of the night from a stage. On his Broadway show, titled Undisputed Truth, and later on his podcast, Hotboxin', Tyson spun the encounter into a piece of theater, and at the center of it was a single, sensational claim. Tyson said that Green had been under the influence of a forbidden substance that night. A forbidden substance, he called it. And in Tyson's telling, that was the explanation for the thing that unnerved him most, the way Green kept rising. He described knocking the man down and Green getting back up, knocking him down again and Green rising once more, as if the punishment simply would not register. Tyson framed that eerie refusal to stay down as the product of whatever was coursing through Green's system. But now we have to slow down and be honest about what this claim actually is, because this is the single most sensational detail in Mitch Green's entire story, and it rests on the shakiest possible foundation. That claim comes from one source, and one source alone, Mike Tyson himself, telling a story for entertainment. There is no toxicological report that confirms it. There is no court record that establishes it. There is no independent witness account in the surviving evidence that backs it up. It is Tyson's account, nothing more. And there is good reason for caution. Observers have long questioned whether Tyson embellished the details of that night for dramatic effect, sharpening the edges, heightening the danger, turning a messy street confrontation into a polished piece of stage myth. A Broadway audience wants a story, and a story grows in the telling. More than that, Green's own version contradicts the entire framing. Remember, in Green's account, there was no drawn-out brawl at all, only a sudden blow and a champion who fled. If Green is to be believed, the very scene Tyson describes, the repeated knockdowns and miraculous risings, may never have happened as told. This is also the moment to lay to rest a darker myth that has attached itself to Green's name. It has sometimes been said that this incident permanently damaged not just his face, but his mind. And here we must be careful and fair. The facial injuries are real and documented, the swollen eye, the stitches. But there is no medical record, no psychiatric documentation, nothing in the credible evidence to support the claim that his sanity was destroyed that night. To state it as fact would be to repeat a rumor as though it were a diagnosis. What can be said honestly is something quieter and sadder. In the years that followed, Green's behavior grew more erratic, his career more chaotic, his conflicts more frequent. That deterioration is documented in canceled fights, in courtroom troubles, in strange nights inside the ring. But the cause remains unknown, and no one narrating this story responsibly can pretend otherwise. The man was unraveling. Why he was unraveling is a question the record does not fully answer. Nearly a decade after that Harlem morning, Green would try to force an answer out of a system that had never given him one. He would take his grievance against Mike Tyson into a courtroom, and he would put a staggering number on it. By 1997, Mitch Green had spent years telling anyone who would listen that he had been wronged by promoters, by managers, and by the man who left him bloodied on a Harlem street. And so he turned to the one arena he had never truly tested. Not the ring, the courtroom. Green filed a lawsuit against Mike Tyson over the injuries from that pre-dawn altercation, and the figure he attached to it was enormous: $25 million. Think about what that number represented for a man in his position. It was not just a demand for money. It was an attempt to convert a lifetime of grievance into something official, something a jury would stamp and validate. Vindication with a dollar sign. For a fighter who felt the sport had cheated him at every turn, this was the last, biggest swing. This was the moment he tried to make the justice system deliver what the streets and the fight game never had. But the reckoning that came back was crushing in its smallness. A New York jury did award him damages, $45,000 for pain and suffering. Not $25 million, $45,000. And the jury went further, specifically rejecting the broader assault and battery claim that had been the emotional heart of his case. In the eyes of the law, he was owed something for his suffering, yes, but the grand story of a champion assaulting him in the street did not carry the day. And then came the final bitter twist, the kind that seemed to follow Mitch Green like a shadow. That $45,000 did not even cover his legal fees. Read that slowly. He won his case, technically. He walked away with a jury verdict in his favor. And he still came out behind, still owing more than he received. Once again, Mitch Green ended up on the wrong side of the numbers. There is a terrible symmetry to it. More than a decade earlier, he had stepped into the ring against Tyson for a purse that insulted him, a fraction of what the other man earned. Now, at the end of his legal war against that same man, the arithmetic betrayed him all over again. The amounts had changed. The pattern had not. Whether it was a fight contract or a courtroom judgment, the money always seemed to shrink in his hands until it slipped through his fingers entirely. But by the time that verdict came down, the ring had already witnessed the strangest night of his entire career, a night when the man who had become famous for refusing to fall did something no one expected. He refused to fight at all. In February of 1993, after years away from serious competition, Mitch Green returned to the ring. He was 36 years old now, matched against a journeyman named Bruce Johnson. On paper, it was a comeback, a chance to remind the world of the toughness that had carried him 10 rounds with a young Mike Tyson. What actually unfolded was one of the most bizarre performances the sport had ever seen. Because Green did not fight. Not really. Once again consumed by grievances over his purse and his new manager, he simply refused to throw punches. He stood in the ring, arguing constantly with the referee, turning what was supposed to be a boxing match into a public protest. The official grew more and more exasperated, until, in the third round, he had seen enough and stopped the contest. A comeback that was really a demonstration. A fighter using the ring not to fight, but to broadcast his rage at the men he believed had cheated him. That strange night set the tone for a decade of decline and defiance. Through the 1990s, Green kept resurfacing, sporadic returns, always chasing something. He made bids for a state heavyweight title against fringe contenders, facing a man named Melvin Foster in 1994 and Brian Nix in 1998. These were not championship stages. They were the far outskirts of the sport, the places fighters end up when the big doors have long since closed. And the troubles kept multiplying. A 1998 victory over an opponent named Mike Dixon was wiped from the record, overturned to a no contest after Green tested positive for a forbidden substance. A win erased. Another mark against a name that was collecting them faster than victories. The conflicts with management, meanwhile, turned genuinely dangerous. A planned fight in 1995 against the rising heavyweight Shannon Briggs fell apart entirely when Green was arrested for destroying his manager's office during a dispute. And there were reports, and here the versions differ, so it must be said with care, of an escalating confrontation involving a firearm that helped harm the bout for good. Whatever the precise truth of that night, the direction was unmistakable. The war Mitch Green had been waging against the money side of boxing for more than a decade had finally curdled into something self-destructive, spilling out of arenas and into offices and police reports. And yet, this is the part that captures the man completely. Even as his career dissolved into canceled fights and overturned results, Mitch Green would not stop. He kept lacing up the gloves, well into his 40s, chasing something that no longer existed. There is a particular kind of stubbornness that keeps an aging fighter coming back long after the world has stopped watching. For Mitch Green, that stubbornness carried him into the early 2000s, still climbing into rings, still convinced there was something left to win. And in a strange way, he did win, though the victories came with asterisks the size of the trophies. In the early 2000s, Green picked up a pair of championship belts. But these were minor titles, the kind that carry impressive-sounding names and very little genuine standing in the sport. On the 9th of March, 2002, he won the World Boxing Empire Super Heavyweight title with a 12-round decision over an opponent named Danny Wofford. A championship, a belt to hold up. And yet it sat in a corner of the sport, far removed from the world stage where Green had once believed he belonged. He never defended it. He never defended either of the minor titles he collected in those final years. They were less like reigns and more like souvenirs, proof that the fire still burned, even if there was almost no one left in the arena to feel its heat. There was even, at one strange point, talk of Green being considered as a potential participant in the early days of a new kind of combat spectacle, the Ultimate Fighting Championship, a measure of just how far his path had drifted from the heavyweight boxing glory he once seemed destined for. His final professional bout came on the 2nd of August, 2005. He won it, a 4th-round knockout of an opponent named Billy Mitchum. And there is something quietly fitting about the fact that his career ended not with a defeat, not with a collapse, but with a knockout in his favor. The man who built his legend on refusing to fall closed his fighting life by putting someone else on the canvas. But by then, the fights themselves had become almost beside the point. The real story of Mitch Green in those years was no longer about wins and losses. It was about a man who could not let go, who kept returning to the only place that had ever given him respect, long after the sport itself had moved on and left him behind. The gloves came off for the last time in 2005. And the question that had haunted his whole story remained. What in the end, was all that toughness for? So we return, at the last, to that stubborn fact that opened this whole story. Across all those rounds against the most feared young fighter of his era, Mitch Green never touched the canvas. And somehow that image, a man refusing to fall, became the perfect symbol, not just for one fight, but for an entire life. Because consider everything that tried to knock him down. 2 bullets on a Bronx street corner before he was even old enough to vote. A canceled Olympic dream, decided by politics far above his head. A purse that insulted him. Managers he believed betrayed him. A championship machine that kept rearranging itself to leave him outside the room. A courtroom that handed him a victory worth less than the cost of winning it. Time after time after time, the world found new ways to put Mitch Green on the floor. And time after time, in his own defiant, difficult, sometimes self-destructive way, he got back up. That defiance was his gift and his curse in equal measure. The same refusal to bend that made him unforgettable in the ring made him nearly impossible to manage outside of it. He would not accept what he saw as injustice, would not swallow an insult, would not stay quiet when he believed he was being cheated. In another life, with different luck and different men around him, that fire might have carried him to a world title. In this life, it left him famous mostly for a street confrontation and a lawsuit and a series of strange, sad nights. And yet, the record refuses to let him be erased. On the 23rd of March, 2025, Mitch "Blood" Green was inducted into the New York State Boxing Hall of Fame, a formal, permanent acknowledgement that this man, for all his chaos, belonged to the history of the sport. He lives now in Jamaica, Queens, the borough that had been part of his life for decades. Was Mitch Green destroyed by Mike Tyson, by the promoters who controlled his money, or by his own fierce, unyielding refusal to ever bend to anyone? The honest answer is that no single hand knocked him down, because in the end, nothing ever fully did. He was the fighter who went the distance and never fell. And maybe that is exactly how he should be remembered. Not as a footnote in another man's legend, but as a man who, against everything, simply would not go down.